As I branch out to new species within the same genus, sometimes it can feel a bit repetitive. I'm sure some of you can relate to that. It isn't quite as exciting as seeing a brand new set of behaviors from a fish you've never worked with before. Aside from fish breeding as a hobby being a bit of a numbers game, the reason I keep doing it is because each new species offers a chance to learn something new. To see a small piece of a wide spectrum of behaviors that maybe I didn't notice before. Working with Corydoras Similis was one of those instances where largely it was just another Cory. But once again, I got to learn something new that I've heard but never understood. It all started with an initial group of 8 fish. That's a number that usually works well for me when I want to make sure I get a passable ratio of males to females. Notice I say usually. That's what the English majors call foreshadowing. As I always do for Corys, I let the group grow and mature for about 6 months before even attempting to trigger spawns. During that time, I fed them my usual assortment of protein-rich foods, including high-quality dry pellets, leftover brine shrimp, and bloodworms. Ordinarily, I would also be using freeze-dried tubifex, but for some reason, these Similis had zero appetite for them. I've never seen a Cory turn down tubifex, but I guess they developed a refined palate. As the fish grew larger, they started to show their sexual dimorphism. I always judge by looking at the fish from above. This is a male and female side by side. The larger and wider one is a female. To me, that's a very reliable way to tell the difference, assuming the fish are close to the same age. Notice also how long and thin the dorsal fins are. That's a cool feature of this species. I don't think I've seen that fin shape on any other Corydoras species. I have a thought about these fins. Take a quick look at this male by himself. The fins are long and thin, sure, but now look at the female. They're much longer and I think beyond proportion to her size. I don't know for sure, but I suspect that this might be another sexual dimorphism. Before we move on, I should mention this all happened in a 10-gallon tank with an overhead sump to give it some extra water volume. The temperature was 75 to 76 degrees, and this was all in tap water with middle-of-the-road hardness. Tank-bred Similis don't seem to be picky, and in most respects, they really were just another Cory. When the male-female size disparity becomes as pronounced as I showed you before, that's when I start looking for breeding activity. I step up the feeding, do more water changes with slightly cooler water, and usually I place a spawning mop in the direction of water flow. Corydoras, in my experience so far, seem universally to prefer placing their eggs in a region with a noticeable current. The usual Cory tricks worked in this case, and they quickly began to spawn. I was able to see the usual spawning chaos, a few T-poses, and I'm going to skip a few steps here, but I got some eggs. I'll come back to the rest later. These are the most distinctly yellow eggs I've ever seen come out of Corydoras. I don't yet know why, but regardless of fertility, and I can now say irrespective of diet, they just seem to come out yellow. A few of you can probably tell just by looking at these eggs that few, if any, are fertilized. Those white spots should be a translucent amber. I got very few fry from my first spawns, and I realized quickly that the sex ratio of my adult group was way off. Now, I've always heard, and I bet you have too, that Corys should be bred in a ratio of 2 males to every female. But I've never really had tangible experience to suggest that that's true. I'm pretty sure I've never quoted that ratio in a normative statement, but this is why I think people make that recommendation. After watching a couple of spawns, I realized that I only had one male participating in the process, and in fact, I'm pretty sure I only had one male in the whole group. Now, why does this matter? In the past, I've done a lot of musing about the mechanics of Corydoras egg fertilization, and over time I've come to the personal conclusion that there's no magic or mystery to it. I don't think milt passes through the body. I don't think gill movement expedites its travel. I think it's simpler than that. I think it comes out of the male and flows in a scattershot approach through the water just above the ground until it reaches the eggs held between the female's ventral fins. There's a term that I've completely made up that I use to describe the way that Corydoras and Apistogramma, for example, fertilize their eggs. That is indirect fertilization. They don't make close contact with the eggs when they fertilize. That would be opposed to direct fertilization, as we might see in egg layers like Crebensis or rams. The species that I see using indirect fertilization tend to have a lower egg fertility rate on average, and I also think that it's much less efficient, meaning it takes more milt to get the job done. In short, you need more male Corydoras than females, because the males run out of ammo faster than the females do. Remember, this is just my interpretation of events, but to me it seems like a reasonable conclusion to draw. With all that said, I still don't think I'll ever say that you must have 2 males for every female. That's because I've watched a lot of spawns in person, and I've never seen one where every female was spawning at the same time or even on the same day. I usually only see half or fewer of the females actually producing eggs. The others might spawn a few days later, or never. I've seen some duds. With that in mind, if you had a group of 5 females and 3 males, for example, I bet you would never notice a problem. In my case, with just one male, I did have a problem. So, for the first time, I had to go back, buy more fish to add to the group, wait for them to grow up, and try again. So here's what I went in with the second time. I think there's 16 of them. Still female heavy to my eyes, but like I said, any number of males greater than 1 usually works out, and I have that now. So back to the spawns. The whole process was very typical of Corydoras. 1 or more males chased a female around until she decided, based on some unknown criteria, that a male was a suitable partner. They would then enter what we call the T position. That's the female in the front, and you might be able to see she has 2 yellow eggs clamped between her ventral fins. She's using her catfish face to hold onto the male while he releases milk to fertilize the eggs. After a moment of silent reflection, the female takes off to find a suitable place to deposit those eggs. As usual, the overwhelming majority of eggs ended up in the spawning mop. Later that day, I carefully picked the eggs out of the mop and placed them somewhere safe to hatch. As you can see, this was a much more productive spawn. Maybe too much so. I placed the eggs in one of my fry trays, and again I used mildly tannic water and a thin layer of sand on the bottom of the tray, taken from the adult's tank. I tried to re-adhere as many eggs as I could to the walls of the tray. They lose their adhesiveness after a while, and I think I missed the window from most of them. The majority ended up falling to the bottom, which is fine. I don't usually see a dramatic difference between eggs that are re-adhered and those that aren't. It just makes it easier for the fry to break loose from their eggs if the eggs are adhered to a surface. It gives them leverage as they wiggle their way out. At the same temperature of 75 or 76 degrees, eggs began to hatch toward the end of 4 days and into the morning of the 5th. In the day prior, I could see them twisting and turning inside their eggs as they prepared to hatch. This dark brown color to the eggs is typical when the water is tannic. They tend to absorb some of the color. Here's an example of an egg that wasn't fertile. You can see there isn't any fungus growing on it. That's the purpose of the tannic water. In conjunction with clean, flowing water, it does a great job of suppressing fungal growth that might cover and kill even the healthy eggs. And here are a few of the first escapees, darting around near their empty eggshells. This one spinning in circles must have hatched more recently. It's normal to see fry do a bit of spinning as their bodies straighten out after being packed into an egg, but this one appears to be bent at more like a 90-degree angle. That's rare, but it happens, and he probably won't last very long. The rest of the fry came out looking great. They have large yellow egg sacs that will continue to provide them with nutrients until they're fully absorbed. For the first day after hatching, I don't try to feed them. Somewhere in the second day is where I start feeding. I like to begin with a fry powder mixed with water so that it sinks rather than floating on the surface. I like to use a pipette to target feed the mixture around the edges where the fry congregate. I'll do this several times throughout the first day. There's quite a few empty eggshells in here that I'll remove soon after this with a different pipette. There's no sense in letting that much organic material decay around the fry. After dispersing some food, and especially in the first days, I like to turn off any direct lighting so that the fry feel comfortable roaming out into the open to find food wherever it happened to settle on the bottom. On the following day, I check to see that their bodies have narrowed and their mouths have widened. This to me is a signal that they're ready to handle a larger and more substantial food. At this point, I start introducing baby brine shrimp, and I continue to feed several times a day. This will be their primary food source until they're well into their juvenile phase. After feeding brine shrimp for the first time, I always check back later to see how many of the fry have a visible orange spot inside their bodies. This tells me who was able to eat the brine shrimp and who wasn't. If I timed it wrong and it seems like a few fry were too small for the brine shrimp, I'll continue to use the fry powder until they catch up. This group is looking great. I certainly solved my numbers problem, didn't I? Once they get to a size where they're comfortably eating brine shrimp, you've pretty much got it made. Mortality after this point should be near zero. Here they are a week later and quite a bit larger. It's always hard to judge without seeing them side by side, but in sheer mass, I bet they're 8 to 10 times the size they were a week ago. From this angle, you can get a better idea of the number. The water is clear now, so I must have done a water change or two, probably just cleaning up any brine shrimp that flushed out of the fry tray and landed on the tank bottom. This is sitting on a 5-gallon, by the way. Plenty of water volume for fry this size, at least for a couple of weeks. This is 1 week later, and now I have to be more concerned about cleanliness and water quality. There's a lot of food going into the tray to feed this many fry, and you can see I have the water flow turned up quite a bit. There's a decent number of you that are using these trays now, so take a look at the flow rate. The bubbles aren't out of control, it isn't sputtering, but it's moving enough water to displace the sand below it. Just keep that in mind. it moves a lot more water than you think. I've seen quite a few of these on video, and in most cases, I think that most of you can turn the air way down. Here's one more look, another week later. This is 3 weeks old. This is probably as far as I should push an enclosure like this with this number of fish. I took this video just before releasing them into a 20 long to give them some breathing room. And then I didn't film them again until this last weekend, which was 2 months later to the day. As you see them now, they're approximately 3 months old. At this size, they're still getting some brine shrimp, but I've switched primarily to the same dry pellets that I was feeding the adults. Right now, they've got the look, but not the size. I expect I'll be growing these out for at least another month or two before they're ready to be sold. I ordered the original group of adults close to 2 years ago. Bad luck on that first sex ratio really cost me some time. Otherwise, I would say this was very successful. And they're a beautiful looking fish, aren't they? Unfortunately, they were given not one but two of the worst common names I've ever heard. They aren't violet, and smudge spot just sounds awful. So I say we pick a new one. Leave a comment and let me know what you would call them instead. Not creative? No problem. Remember, the bar to meet is smudge spot. Just know that Fishy McFishface has already been suggested, by me, so you can't have that one. With that, I'll wrap this one up. The next breeding video, barring some catastrophe, will be Bozemanite rainbows. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.